In the early days of Christianity, as the fledgling movement was still defining its identity, the teachings and stories of Jesus began to spread across the region. These narratives, passed down orally at first, were eventually committed to writing by those who had heard them firsthand or through early Christian communities. This process gave rise to the first three collection of stories known as the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, and Luke, texts that would later be known as the Synoptic Gospels. The term synoptic reflects the remarkable alignment among these three Gospels. They share many of the same stories, often in similar sequences, and at times, even with nearly identical wording. This striking consistency has led scholars to conclude that both Matthew and Luke likely drew from Mark. Mark suggested to be dated at around 70 CE, as a foundational source. Yet, this conclusion, while illuminating, also brings to light a more complex and challenging issue concerning these texts. Despite their presumed early origins, the manuscripts that form today's Bible are not from the original writings. The earliest complete copies of the Synoptic Gospels that we possess date back to at least 300 years after Jesus' life and ascension, known as the Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus. This significant gap between the events described and the surviving manuscripts invites questions about the transmission of these texts. How might they have evolved over centuries of copying and recopying? What might have been lost, added, or altered along the way? And is the text preserved enough to be even considered reliable? This reality adds a layer of complexity to our understanding of these ancient texts. While the Synoptic Gospels provide a coherent and consistent narrative of Jesus' life and teachings, the fact that our earliest complete manuscripts come from centuries later means that the stories we read today are the products of a long and intricate history of transmission. This gap in time challenges us to consider how these texts were preserved, transmitted, and possibly transformed as they were handed down through generations of believers. This also presents what is referred to as the synoptic problem, but also multiple paradoxes due to a manifold of contradictions. Yet, even though the first three Gospels, within Matthew and Luke, there are sayings of Jesus that do not appear in Mark, the earliest Gospel, suggesting the existence of another shared source. Scholars refer to this hypothetical document as Q, a collection of Jesus' sayings that Matthew and Luke both had access to or added. But the sources don't stop there. Matthew includes material unique to his Gospel, often labeled M, while Luke contains unique material referred to as L. These special sources, alongside the shared content of Q, M, and L, form a complex web of information that predates the Gospel of John. What is striking about these early sources is their silence on one significant matter: in none of them does Jesus explicitly refer to himself as God. Across these multiple accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, Q, M, and L, there is a consistent portrayal of Jesus as a teacher, a healer, and a prophet, but not as one who directly claims divinity. This absence becomes even more noteworthy when we consider the Gospel of John, the latest of the Gospels, where Jesus begins to be depicted in more divine terms, even referring to himself as God, or so do the people claim with the famed verse that says, "Before Abraham was, I am," which we will get to later in the video. The weight of this evidence raises a perplexing question. How could it be that in 6 earlier sources, none of the authors recorded Jesus proclaiming himself as God if indeed he had done so? Would not such a revelation have been of utmost importance to include? The idea that all 6 writers, drawing from various traditions and sources, would neglect to mention something so pivotal seems highly improbable. Instead, it suggests that the depiction of Jesus calling himself God may be a later development, one that emerges only in the Gospel of John, reflecting theological evolution, possibly influenced by politics, rather than historical memory. When the sources are lined up chronologically, a pattern emerges that challenges traditional assumptions about Jesus' identity. The earliest accounts of his life and teachings, particularly in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, portrayed Jesus in more human terms. It is only in later writings, such as the Gospel of John, that his divinity becomes a central focus. This gradual shift in portrayal not only raises important questions about how early Christians understood Jesus, but also highlights the diverse beliefs that existed within the early Christian community. The debate over whether Jesus ever explicitly claimed to be God has long been a point of contention among scholars, theologians, and lay people alike. The Synoptic Gospels, which are among the earliest accounts, do not contain any direct statements from Jesus declaring himself as God. However, some passages have been interpreted over the centuries as implying his divinity, leading to the question, did Jesus subtly claim to be God, or is this a later theological interpretation developed by the early church? This exploration into the evolving understanding of Jesus' nature underscores the complexity and diversity of early followers of Jesus and their thoughts, inviting ongoing reflection and debate. One passage that often comes up in these discussions is found in Mark 2. In this story, Jesus is teaching in a crowded house when 4 men lower a paralyzed man through the roof, desperate for their friend to be healed. Jesus, seeing their faith, tells the man, "Your sins are forgiven." This statement immediately raises eyebrows among the Pharisees present, who murmur, "Who can forgive sins but God alone?" In response, Jesus challenges them, asking which is easier to say, "Your sins are forgiven," or "Take up your pallet and walk." To demonstrate his authority, Jesus commands the man to walk, and the man is miraculously healed, leaving the crowd in awe. Many interpreters have pointed to this passage as evidence that Jesus was subtly claiming divine authority, equating his ability to forgive sins with that of God. After all, if only God can forgive sins, and Jesus forgave sins, then doesn't that imply that Jesus is God? Yet, a closer examination of the text and the broader context suggests a different understanding. First, it's important to notice the language Jesus uses. He does not say, "I forgive your sins," but rather, "Your sins are forgiven." This phrasing suggests that Jesus is acting under divine authority, not claiming it as his own. It's a distinction that is crucial for understanding the passage. Jesus is not declaring himself to be God, but rather demonstrating that he has been granted the authority by God to forgive sins on earth. This is evident when Jesus says, "But I want you to know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." So he said to the man, "I tell you, get up, take your mat and go home." He got up, took his mat and walked out in full view of them all. This amazed everyone and they praised God, saying, "We have never seen anything like this." This interpretation is further supported by other instances in the Gospels where Jesus extends this authority to his disciples with the will of God. Near the end of the Gospel narratives, Jesus commissions his followers to spread his teachings and even grants them the power to forgive sins. If the ability to forgive sins were evidence of divinity, then this would imply that the disciples themselves are gods, a notion that is clearly untenable within the broader Christian tradition. This can be read in John 20 verses 21 to 23. Therefore, while some might see in these passages an implication of Jesus' divinity, a careful reading suggests that Jesus was not claiming to be God. Instead, he was exercising a divinely granted authority, one that he would later share with his disciples. The idea that Jesus was claiming to be God appears to be a later theological development, one that gains prominence in the Gospel of John rather than in the earlier synoptic accounts. This perspective invites readers to reconsider traditional interpretations and to explore the rich complexities of the Gospel texts with fresh eyes. That is, of course, with the understanding that the text has been altered through bad transmission, additions, interpolation, and mistranslations. The Gospel of John presents a dramatic shift in the portrayal of Jesus compared to the earlier synoptic Gospels. One of the most striking moments in John's narrative occurs when Jesus declares, "Before Abraham was, I am." To modern readers, this statement might seem puzzling, but its implications would have been profound for those familiar with the Hebrew Scriptures. The phrase "I am" is laden with significance in the Old Testament. In Exodus 3, when Moses encounters the burning bush, he asks God for his name. God responds, "I am who I am," instructing Moses to tell the Israelites that I has sent him. This declaration becomes a cornerstone of Jewish understanding of God's identity, representing the eternal, self-existent nature of the divine. Thus, when Jesus uses the phrase "I am" in John's Gospel, he appears to be invoking the divine name, a claim that his contemporaries would have recognized immediately. This is why, according to the narrative, his Jewish opponents react with such hostility, picking up stones to execute him for blasphemy. The weight of this statement cannot be overstated. It is one of the clearest instances where Jesus seems to claim divinity in the New Testament. Yet, this depiction raises significant questions. Could Jesus have really made such a bold claim, and if so, why is this not mentioned in the earlier Gospels or other early Christian writings? When examining this passage, it's important to consider the context of John's Gospel, which was written 80 to 90 years after Jesus' death. By this time, the early Christian community had evolved, and its understanding of Jesus' identity had deepened. The theological reflection present in John's Gospel is more developed than in the earlier texts, reflecting a community grappling with the nature of Jesus as both human and divine. If Jesus had been openly claiming the divine name for himself during his lifetime, it's unlikely he would have survived to continue his ministry. The Jewish leaders, vigilant against blasphemy, would have moved swiftly to silence such a radical claim. Furthermore, the silence of earlier sources on this matter is telling. Neither Matthew, Mark, Luke, nor even Paul, who is one of the earliest writers of the New Testament and who clearly understands Jesus as a divine figure, mentions Jesus explicitly claiming to be God in this way. If such a significant declaration had been part of Jesus' ministry, it's hard to believe it would have gone unrecorded in these earlier texts. Instead, it seems that the depiction of Jesus as using the divine name "I am" in the Gospel of John reflects a later theological development. The author of John's Gospel, writing for a community deeply engaged with questions of Jesus' divine identity, presents a Jesus who boldly claims divinity in a way that resonates with the community's evolving understanding. This portrayal likely reflects more about the beliefs of the Johannine community than the historical Jesus himself. But another explanation is also possible. Although that word itself can be understood as that before Abraham, God existed. Meaning that if God sent Jesus, all Jesus needs to know about Abraham is through God. Nevertheless, this is not how the majority of modern Christians like to interpret this. As we trace the evolution of the Gospels, from the more human portrayal of Jesus in the Synoptic Gospels to the divine mistranslations or assertions in the Gospel of John, it becomes clear that the early Christian understanding of Jesus was far from monolithic. The diverse and sometimes conflicting depictions invite us to question how these texts were shaped by their historical contexts, theological debates, and the needs of the communities that preserved them. The gap between the events of Jesus' life and the earliest surviving manuscripts further complicates our understanding, highlighting the challenges of reconstructing an accurate historical picture from texts that have been transmitted and transformed over centuries. Yet, these complexities also enrich our exploration of early Christianity, offering a deeper appreciation for the dynamic and multifaceted nature of the faith as it developed in its formative years. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the origins and evolution of the Gospels on Mind Polish. If you found this discussion thought-provoking, make sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more explorations into early Christian history and theology. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you won't miss our next videos. Have thoughts or questions? Leave them in the comments below. Let's keep the conversation going.